The Charleston coastal wind carried the scent of salt and magnolia blossoms through the parking lot of Mercy Harbor Medical Center on that humid August morning. The sun had barely risen above the Atlantic horizon when a silver sedan pulled into the staff lot, finding a spot in the farthest corner, away from the reserved spaces near the entrance. The driver sat motionless for several minutes, hands still on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the 5-story building that would become her new world. Lena Parker stepped out of the car with the quiet deliberation of someone who had learned to measure every movement. She was 34 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes the color of storm clouds over the ocean. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that would make anyone look twice. She wore simple navy scrubs, carried a modest bag, and walked toward the employee entrance with steps that seemed designed to leave no impression on the pavement beneath her feet. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a burst of cold antiseptic air that contrasted sharply with the southern humidity outside. Lena paused for just a moment, allowing her senses to adjust to the new environment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow on linoleum floors polished to a reflective shine. Nurses and orderlies moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their footsteps creating a constant rhythm that formed the heartbeat of the institution. She made her way to the Human Resources office on the second floor, where a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose looked up from a stack of paperwork. Margaret Chen had processed hundreds of new employees over her 15 years at Mercy Harbor, and she prided herself on her ability to read people within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. When Lena Parker stood before her desk, Margaret felt an unusual sensation of uncertainty, as if she were looking at a photograph that refused to come into focus. Lena Parker, reporting for orientation, the new arrival said, her voice soft but clear, devoid of any particular regional accent. Margaret shuffled through her files until she found the appropriate folder. The documentation was complete, unremarkable in every way. Nursing license from Virginia, previous employment at a small community hospital in the Shenandoah Valley, basic certifications all current. Everything was in order, yet something about the sparse nature of the file nagged at the back of Margaret's mind. There were no letters of recommendation that sang praises, no performance reviews that highlighted exceptional achievements, just the bare minimum required for employment. "Sir, welcome to Mercy Harbor," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "You will be assigned to the emergency department on the night shift. We are short-staffed, as always, so you will be starting immediately after orientation." Lena simply nodded, accepting this information without question or complaint. Most new hires would have expressed some concern about being thrown into the demanding chaos of the emergency room without adequate preparation time. Most would have asked questions about schedules, benefits, or at least the location of the cafeteria. Lena asked nothing. She simply waited for Margaret to continue. The orientation process took the better part of the morning. Lena followed the designated trainer through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, listening attentively but rarely speaking. She learned the locations of supply closets, medication rooms, and emergency equipment. She memorized the codes announced over the intercom system and the protocols for various crisis situations. Throughout it all, she remained a passive observer, absorbing information like water into sand, leaving no visible trace of the knowledge she was accumulating. By the time afternoon arrived, Lena had been introduced to the day shift staff of the emergency department. The reactions were uniformly tepid. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a veteran emergency physician with 20 years of experience, barely glanced up from her computer screen when the introduction was made. The charge nurse, a formidable woman named Gloria Hastings, looked Lena up and down with the appraising eye of someone accustomed to sorting wheat from chaff. "Another one from the temp pool," Gloria muttered to a colleague as Lena was led away. "She will not last 2 weeks. Mark my words." The colleague, a young nurse named Tyler with bright red hair and an abundance of freckles, laughed quietly. "She looks like a strong wind would knock her over. Did you see how she barely made eye contact with anyone? How is she supposed to deal with patients in crisis if she cannot even look at the staff?" Their words carried further than they intended, or perhaps exactly as far as they intended. Lena heard every syllable, processed them with the same calm attention she gave to everything else, and stored them away without visible reaction. She had expected this reception, had in fact anticipated something worse. The healthcare environment, particularly in high-stress departments, operated on a hierarchy that valued confidence, assertiveness, and visible competence. Her deliberate choice to present none of these qualities marked her immediately as an outsider, someone to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Her first official shift began at 7 that evening, as the last light of the summer sun painted the Charleston skyline in shades of orange and pink. The emergency department transformed during the transition from day to night, taking on a different character entirely. The administrative presence faded, replaced by a skeleton crew of physicians and nurses who operated with a kind of grim camaraderie born of shared adversity. Lena was assigned to triage, the front line of the emergency room where patients were assessed and prioritized based on the severity of their conditions. It was considered one of the less desirable positions, requiring constant interaction with anxious family members, impatient patients, and the endless stream of minor complaints that clogged the system. For a new nurse, it was also a test, a way for the established staff to observe her performance without risking critical patients. The night began slowly, with the usual assortment of minor injuries and chronic conditions that could have been handled by a primary care physician but ended up in the emergency room due to lack of alternatives. Lena processed each patient with methodical efficiency, asking the necessary questions, recording vital signs, and assigning appropriate priority levels. Her manner was gentle but distant, professional without being warm. Around midnight, the pace began to accelerate. A car accident on the highway brought in multiple victims simultaneously, stretching the department's resources thin. Lena watched from her position at the triage desk as the more experienced staff rushed to handle the influxee, their movements a choreographed dance of controlled chaos. She did not insert herself into the action, did not volunteer her assistance or attempt to prove her worth. She simply continued her assigned duties, maintaining the flow of incoming patients while the crisis unfolded around her. It was during this period of heightened activity that Dr. Michael Harris first took notice of her. Harris was the attending physician on duty that night, a tall man in his mid-40s with graying temples and the perpetually irritated expression of someone who believed the world consistently failed to meet his standards. He had built his career on technical excellence and an intimidating presence that kept subordinates in line and colleagues at a respectful distance. When he saw Lena sitting calmly at the triage desk while his department struggled with the accident victims, something in him bristled with immediate dislike. The days that followed Lena's arrival at Mercy Harbor Medical Center established a pattern that would define her existence within those walls. She arrived early for every shift, stayed late when needed, and accepted without complaint the tasks that others avoided. She cleaned up after difficult patients, restocked supplies that had been neglected, and took meal breaks only when the department was fully covered. Her work was competent, thorough, and utterly unremarkable in its execution. The staff's initial indifference gradually crystallized into something more defined, a consensus that Lena Parker was simply not cut out for emergency medicine. The evidence seemed overwhelming to those who cared to observe. She never raised her voice, even when patients became aggressive or family members demanded immediate attention. She deferred to other nurses in situations where assertiveness was expected. During codes and critical interventions, she positioned herself at the periphery, handing over supplies when asked, but never pushing her way to the center of the action. Gloria Hastings, the charge nurse whose opinion carried considerable weight in the department, made her assessment known within the first week. "That woman has no fire in her belly," she declared during a staff meeting, not bothering to lower her voice despite Lena's presence at the back of the room. Emergency nursing requires a certain personality type. You need to be able to take control of a situation, to command respect from patients and families. She just fades into the background like wallpaper. Tyler, the young nurse who had been among the first to dismiss Lena, had become her most vocal critic. He found endless amusement in her quiet demeanor, mimicking her soft voice and reserved body language for the entertainment of his colleagues. "Watch this," he would say before approaching her with some mundane question. then returning to report on how she had responded with minimal words and downcast eyes. It is like talking to a ghost. I do not think she has said more than 10 sentences to me since she started. The mockery was not always subtle. Comments were made within her earshot about her competence, her personality, her fitness for the job. Lana absorbed these remarks with the same impassive calm she brought to everything else. She did not defend herself, did not attempt to change their perceptions, did not seek allies among the staff. This refusal to engage only intensified the criticism, as if her silence were an admission of the inadequacies they attributed to her. Dr. Michael Harris took a particular interest in Lena's perceived failures. As the senior attending physician on the night shift, he wielded considerable influence over the nursing staff, and he used this power to marginalize her at every opportunity. He assigned her to the most tedious tasks, excluded her from interesting cases, and publicly questioned her decisions in front of patients and colleagues alike. One evening, approximately 3 weeks into her employment, Harris found what he considered the perfect opportunity to expose her limitations. A patient had arrived with symptoms suggesting a possible cardiac event, and the department was already stretched thin with other emergencies. Harris strode over to the triage area where Lena was stationed, his white coat billowing behind him like a flag of authority. "Parker," he said, his voice carrying across the busy department, "I need you to handle the cardiac workup on bed 7. I assume you are capable of that much." The question was designed to humiliate. A cardiac workup was routine, well within the competence of any emergency nurse, and his implication that even this might be beyond her abilities was clear to everyone within earshot. Several staff members paused in their work, anticipating her response, perhaps hoping for the entertainment of watching her stumble or protest. Lena looked up from her paperwork, meeting his eyes briefly before nodding. "Of course, Dr. Harris." She moved to bed 7 with her characteristic unhurried pace, gathering the necessary equipment along the way. The patient was a man in his 60s, visibly frightened, clutching his chest with one hand while his wife held the other. Lena approached them with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the harsh efficiency of the emergency department. "Good evening, Mr. Patterson," she said, having glanced at his intake form. "I understand you have been experiencing some chest discomfort. I'm going to run some tests to help us understand what is happening. Can you describe what you are feeling?" The man's voice shook as he recounted the pressure in his chest, the shortness of breath that had come on suddenly while he was watching television. His wife interjected frequently, adding details and expressing worry in equal measure. Lena listened attentively to both of them, asking clarifying questions in a tone that somehow managed to calm their visible anxiety. As she attached the electrocardiogram leads to his chest, her movements were precise and efficient, completed in half the time it would have taken many of her colleagues. She positioned each electrode with exact accuracy, adjusting one slightly after the initial placement. It was a minor correction, barely noticeable, but it would ensure a cleaner reading of his heart's electrical activity. The ECG machine hummed to life, and Lena watched the paper scroll out with its zigzagging lines of cardiac data. Her eyes moved across the tracing with practiced fluency, and something in her posture subtly shifted, a tension that had not been there before. She completed the remaining elements of the workup with the same calm efficiency, drawing blood for cardiac enzymes and recording vital signs at precise intervals. When she brought the results to Dr. Harris, who was occupied with another patient across the department, she waited patiently until he acknowledged her presence. His irritation at the interruption was evident, but he snatched the ECG strip from her hand and glanced at it with dismissive speed. "Looks fine to me. Probably just anxiety. Give him some antacids and discharge him when his enzymes come back normal." Lena did not move. "Dr. Harris, if I may, there are some subtle findings in leads 2 and 3 that might warrant a closer look. The ST segments appear slightly elevated, which could indicate early ischemic changes." The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and unwelcome. Harris's expression darkened with the particular anger reserved for those who dared to challenge his expertise. Around them, the department seemed to hold its breath, sensing the confrontation that was building. "Are you questioning my interpretation, Parker?" His voice had dropped to a dangerous register, quiet but carrying clearly to those nearby. Perhaps you would like to explain to me, with your vast experience, what I should be looking for in a cardiac tracing." Lena's response was measured, almost apologetic in tone. "I am not questioning your expertise, Dr. Harris. I simply wanted to ensure you had all the information before making a decision. The changes are subtle, and the lighting here is not ideal for reading tracings." It was a diplomatic retreat, offering him an excuse that preserved his ego while still drawing attention to her concern. Harris was having none of it. He made a show of examining the ECG more closely, then thrust it back toward her with contempt. "There is nothing abnormal about this reading. If you cannot distinguish between normal variant and pathology, perhaps you should consider a less demanding specialty. Now stop wasting my time and discharge the patient as instructed." Lena accepted the ECG and turned away without another word. But she did not immediately discharge Mr. Patterson. Instead, she returned to his bedside, rechecked his vital signs, and found a reason to delay his departure until the cardiac enzyme results returned. When those results showed elevated troponin levels, indicating actual heart muscle damage, she quietly brought them to Dr. Rebecca Morrison, who happened to be passing through the department at the end of her shift. Morrison reviewed the findings, examined the patient herself, and promptly admitted him to the cardiac care unit for further evaluation. A subsequent catheterization revealed a significant blockage in one of his coronary arteries, requiring immediate intervention. Mr. Patterson's wife, upon learning how close her husband had come to being sent home with a potentially fatal condition, broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. The incident passed without fanfare. Morrison assumed she had caught the problem herself, and Harris never acknowledged his error or Lena's role in preventing a tragedy. The staff remained unaware of what had actually transpired, and the narrative of Lena's incompetence continued unaltered. The autumn months brought shorter days and longer nights to Charleston, and with them came the inevitable increase in emergency department traffic. The combination of seasonal illnesses, holiday-related injuries, and the general malaise that seemed to grip the population during the darker months kept the staff of Mercy Harbor in a constant state of exhausted vigilance. Through it all, Lena Parker continued her quiet work, a fixture of the night shift who attracted no more attention than the equipment that surrounded her. But within the administrative offices of the hospital, a different kind of attention was beginning to focus on the unremarkable nurse from Virginia. It started with a routine audit of employee credentials, a bureaucratic exercise performed periodically to ensure compliance with various regulatory requirements. The task fell to Janet Williams, a meticulous woman in her 50s who had spent 3 decades navigating the complex world of healthcare administration. Janet approached her work with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant, cross-referencing documents, verifying certifications, and flagging any inconsistencies for further review. When she reached Lena Parker's file, she expected the same straightforward process she had completed for dozens of other employees. What she found instead was a puzzle that refused to assemble into a coherent picture. The basic credentials were impeccable. Nursing license properly issued and renewed, background check clear, required certifications all current. But beneath this surface of compliance lay a strange emptiness. The previous employer listed, a small community hospital in rural Virginia, had closed its doors 2 years prior, making verification of her employment history challenging. The references she had provided were generic, offering praise so vague it bordered on meaningless. Her educational records showed graduation from an accredited nursing program, but attempts to contact the institution yielded only automated responses. Janet brought her concerns to the Director of Human Resources, a harried man named Robert Chen, who was already juggling a dozen administrative fires. He listened to her presentation with growing impatience, his eyes darting repeatedly to the clock on his office wall. "So what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked when she finished. "That her credentials are fraudulent?" Janet shook her head slowly. "No. Everything checks out from a legal standpoint. There is nothing here that would justify termination or even formal investigation. It is more that there are gaps, places where information should exist but does not. Her file feels hollow in a way I cannot quite articulate." Robert sighed heavily. "Janet, we are operating with a nursing shortage that gets worse every month. If her credentials are valid and her performance is adequate, I cannot afford to create problems where none exist. Keep monitoring the situation if you like, but unless you find something concrete, this conversation never happened." The directive was clear, but Janet could not entirely dismiss her unease. She began paying closer attention to Lena Parker, not in any official capacity, but with the quiet observation of someone who sensed that a story remained untold. What she noticed over the following weeks only deepened her confusion. Lena's clinical skills were competent, nothing more, nothing less. She made no errors that required documentation, but she also demonstrated no exceptional abilities that would mark her as someone to watch. Her interactions with colleagues remained minimal, her demeanor consistently reserved. Yet there were moments, brief and easily missed, when something else seemed to flicker beneath that unremarkable surface. One night, Janet was working late, catching up on paperwork that had accumulated during a particularly chaotic week. Her office window overlooked the ambulance bay, and movement in the darkness below caught her attention. She watched as Lena emerged from the emergency department entrance, apparently on a break. But instead of heading toward the staff parking lot or the small garden area where employees often gathered to smoke or decompress, Lena walked to the far edge of the property, where the hospital grounds met a strip of undeveloped coastline. She stood there for perhaps 15 minutes, motionless, staring out at the dark water of the Atlantic. Her posture was different from what Janet had observed inside the hospital, straighter somehow, more alert. When an ambulance screamed into the bay with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, Lena turned back toward the building with a fluid movement that seemed almost predatory in its efficiency. Janet filed this observation away with the others, a growing collection of small anomalies that refused to form a recognizable pattern. She had no evidence of wrongdoing, no justification for taking action, only the persistent sense that Lena Parker was not quite what she appeared to be. Inside the emergency department, life continued with its usual rhythm of crisis and calm. The staff had largely stopped thinking about Lena at all, which was perhaps the greatest testament to her ability to blend into her surroundings. She had become part of the institutional furniture, acknowledged when necessary but otherwise invisible. Dr. Harris continued his campaign of petty harassment, finding frequent opportunities to criticize her work or exclude her from meaningful cases. His animosity had settled into a chronic condition, no longer requiring fresh provocation, but simply existing as a constant feature of their professional relationship. Lena accepted his treatment with the same equanimity she brought to everything else, never rising to his bait, never giving him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But even in her deliberate obscurity, Lena's presence was beginning to register in ways that defied easy explanation. Patients in her care seemed to stabilize more quickly than expected. Equipment malfunctions were caught before they became critical problems. Medication errors by other staff members were quietly intercepted before reaching their intended recipients. These incidents were individually minor, easily attributed to coincidence or luck, but their cumulative effect was beginning to create a statistical anomaly that only someone looking very carefully would notice. One such incident occurred on a cold November night when a young mother brought her infant daughter to the emergency room. The baby was running a high fever and had been crying inconsolably for hours. The triage assessment classified her as priority 3, uncomfortable but not immediately life-threatening, and the busy department meant a significant wait before she would be seen by a physician. Lena was assigned to monitor the waiting area that night, a thankless task that involved managing the expectations of dozens of anxious patients and family members. She moved through the crowded space with her usual unobtrusive efficiency, checking on those who had been waiting longest, providing updates when possible, and diffusing tensions before they could escalate into confrontations. When she approached the young mother with her crying infant, something in her demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. She spent longer with this patient than protocol required, asking questions that went beyond the standard intake assessment. The mother, exhausted and frightened, found herself pouring out details she had not thought to mention before, about the baby's feeding patterns over the past few days, about a slight change in the color of her skin, about a moment earlier that day when the infant had seemed unusually drowsy. Lena listened to everything, her eyes never leaving the baby's face. Then, without explanation, she picked up the child and walked directly into the treatment area, bypassing the queue entirely. The young mother followed in confusion, and the other waiting patients erupted in protests that Lena ignored completely. She found Dr. Morrison in one of the examination rooms and handed her the infant with words that carried an urgency her voice had never before displayed. "This baby needs immediate attention. I believe she may be developing sepsis. Her fontanelle is slightly bulging, and her mother reports decreased feeding and unusual drowsiness over the past 24 hours. Morrison's experienced eyes performed a rapid assessment that confirmed Lena's concerns. Within minutes, the baby was receiving intravenous antibiotics, and a lumbar puncture revealed the early stages of bacterial meningitis. The treatment had been initiated early enough to prevent permanent damage, early enough to save a life that would otherwise have slipped away while waiting its turn in the triage queue. The incident generated some attention among the staff, primarily focused on Lena's violation of proper triage protocols. Gloria Hastings reprimanded her for jumping the queue, pointing out that other patients had been waiting longer and that playing favorites undermined the entire system. Lena accepted the criticism without defense, offering no explanation for her actions. The fact that her instincts had been correct, that the baby might have suffered irreversible harm without her intervention, was acknowledged by no one. Later that night, as the department settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Dr. Morrison sought out Lena in the supply room where she was restocking basic equipment. The older physician stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the nurse work with her methodical precision. "That was good work earlier," Morrison said finally. "With the baby. How did you know?" Lena did not look up from her task. "I did not know anything, Dr. Morrison. I just had a feeling something was not right. I am sorry for disrupting the normal process." Morrison studied her for a long moment, seeing something in the younger woman that others had missed or chosen to ignore. "Do not apologize for trusting your instincts. That is what separates good nurses from great ones." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "I have noticed some things about you, Parker, things that do not quite add up. I am not asking for explanations, not yet. But I want you to know that someone here sees you, the real you, whoever that might be." Lena finally raised her eyes to meet Morrison's gaze, and for just a moment, the careful mask slipped slightly. Behind it was something complex and guarded, a depth of experience that had no place in the simple resume filed in the Human Resources office. Then the moment passed, and she was once again just the quiet nurse who attracted no attention. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I appreciate your kindness." Morrison nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Whatever you are hiding, whatever brought you here, I hope you know that some secrets are worth keeping, and some are worth sharing with the right people. Think about which category yours falls into." December arrived in Charleston with an unusual chill that settled over the coastal city like a grey blanket. The holiday season brought its predictable surge of activity to Mercy Harbor Medical Center, a mixture of festive accidents, stress-induced ailments, and the loneliness that drove many to seek human connection in the most unlikely of places. The emergency department operated at near capacity most nights, and the staff moved through their shifts with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned to conserve their emotional energy for genuine crises. Lena Parker had been at the hospital for nearly 4 months now, long enough for her presence to become an accepted fact of institutional life. The initial curiosity about her had faded into indifference, replaced by the more pressing concerns of daily survival in an understaffed department. She continued to work the night shifts that others avoided, continued to accept the thankless tasks without complaint, continued to exist at the margins of a world that had decided she was not worth noticing. The pattern of small interventions continued as well, though they remained invisible to those who were not looking for them. A medication dosage error caught before it could cause harm, a patient's subtle change in condition noted and reported before it became critical, equipment calibrated with unusual precision. These quiet contributions added up to an improved outcome rate that statisticians might have found interesting if anyone had bothered to analyze the data with sufficient care. Dr. Harris had not softened in his treatment of Lena, but he had grown bored with the lack of response his provocations generated. His hostility had become ritualistic, a habit maintained more from inertia than genuine feeling. He still assigned her the worst tasks, still questioned her competence in public, still used her as an example of everything wrong with modern nursing education. But the performance had lost its energy, and even his most loyal supporters in the department had stopped finding it entertaining. The shift in dynamics came from an unexpected direction. A new resident had joined the emergency medicine program, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who brought with her a combination of intellectual curiosity and genuine compassion that set her apart from her peers. Sarah was the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they never had, and she approached medicine with a sense of mission that had survived the grueling years of training. From her first week in the department, Sarah noticed things about Lena that others had chosen to ignore. She observed the quiet competence beneath the self-effacing demeanor, the way Lena's eyes tracked multiple situations simultaneously, the subtle interventions that prevented problems before they could develop. When she mentioned these observations to her fellow residents, they dismissed her with knowing smiles. "Do not waste your time on that one," a senior resident named Marcus advised her. "She is basically furniture that occasionally takes vital signs. Harris has her number, and he is not wrong about everything." Sarah was not convinced. She began making excuses to work alongside Lena, requesting her assistance with procedures, asking her opinion on patient presentations. At first, Lena responded to these overtures with the same guarded politeness she showed everyone, deflecting questions and minimizing her contributions. But Sarah was persistent in a gentle way that eventually began to penetrate the careful defenses. One night, during a rare quiet period in the early morning hours, they found themselves alone in the break room. Sarah was struggling with a difficult case, an elderly patient whose symptoms did not fit any clear diagnostic pattern. She had been trained to rely on algorithms and protocols, but this patient defied the standard approaches, and her frustration was evident. "I keep missing something," she said, more to herself than to Lena. "The pieces are all there, but they will not come together." Lena, who had been quietly sipping tea in the corner, spoke without looking up. "Sometimes the pattern only emerges when you stop looking for patterns. What does the patient tell you? Not with words, but with everything else." Sarah turned to face her, surprised by the insight embedded in the simple question. "What do you mean?" Diagnostic algorithms assume that patients present in predictable ways. But people are not algorithms. Their bodies tell stories that do not always fit into categories. "Have you watched this patient? Not examined? Watched. How does she hold herself? Where does her attention go? What happens to her breathing when different topics are discussed?" It was more words than Sarah had ever heard Lena speak at once, and the perspective they offered was unlike anything she had learned in medical school. She returned to her patient's bedside with new eyes, and within an hour had identified a psychological component to the presentation that changed the entire approach to treatment. The next morning, Sarah sought out Lena before the shift change. "How did you know about looking beyond the obvious?" Lena's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes acknowledged the question. "I have learned that the most important information is often the kind that people do not think to share. It hides in the spaces between words, in the things people do when they think no one is watching. Medicine is as much about observation as intervention." Sarah wanted to ask more, wanted to understand how a seemingly unremarkable night nurse had developed such sophisticated insight into human behavior. But something in Lena's posture suggested that the moment of openness had passed, and pressing further would only result in retreat. She filed the conversation away, adding it to her growing collection of evidence that Lena Parker was far more than she appeared. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought increasing chaos to the department. A particularly virulent strain of influenza was making its way through the population, filling beds and straining resources. The staff worked double shifts, covering for colleagues who had themselves fallen ill, and tempers frayed under the constant pressure. Even the most dedicated professionals began to show signs of burnout, their patience worn thin by the relentless demands. Through it all, Lena maintained her equilibrium with an almost supernatural calm. She covered shifts when others could not, stayed late when the department was overwhelmed, and somehow managed to be exactly where she was needed at any given moment. Her endurance was remarkable, as if she had access to reserves of energy that others had long since depleted. But she never drew attention to her contributions, never mentioned the extra hours or the additional burdens she had assumed. It was during this period of heightened stress that Janet Williams from Human Resources made a discovery that reignited her dormant concerns about Lena Parker. While reorganizing archived personnel files, she came across a note from Lena's initial background check that had been overlooked in the rush to fill vacant positions. The note indicated that one of her listed references had been unreachable at the time of hiring, a detail that should have triggered additional verification but had been lost in the shuffle of a particularly busy hiring period. Janet decided to pursue this loose end, tracking down the reference through a series of phone calls and database searches. What she eventually found was not evidence of fraud or deception, but something perhaps more puzzling. The reference did exist: a nurse manager at the defunct Virginia hospital, now retired and living in Florida. But when Janet finally reached her by phone, the woman had no memory of Lena Parker, despite supposedly having supervised her for 3 years. "I am sorry, but that name does not ring any bells," the retired nurse said, genuine confusion in her voice. "And I remember all my nurses. It is a small hospital. Was a small hospital. We were like family." "Are you certain you have the right person?" Janet ended the call with more questions than answers. It was not evidence of anything illegal, but it was deeply strange. People did not simply forget colleagues they had worked with for years. Either the reference was mistaken, or something about Lena Parker's history had been deliberately obscured. She brought her findings to Robert Chen once again, but his response was even more dismissive than before. The holiday season was approaching, the hospital was operating in crisis mode, and he had no appetite for pursuing vague suspicions about an employee who had given them no concrete reason for concern. "Drop it, Janet," he said with finality. "We have real problems to deal with. Whatever your instincts are telling you about this woman, they are not worth the headache of an investigation that will probably lead nowhere." Janet left his office with the uncomfortable feeling of having witnessed something important slip through the cracks of institutional indifference. She could not shake the conviction that Lena Parker was hiding something significant, but she had exhausted her options for official inquiry. All she could do was watch and wait, hoping that whatever secrets the quiet nurse carried would eventually reveal themselves. Christmas Eve found the emergency department in its typical holiday state, a mixture of alcohol-related incidents, family conflicts turned physical, and the crushing sadness of those who had nowhere else to go. Lena worked through the night with her usual steady presence, offering comfort where she could, maintaining efficiency where comfort was not possible. At some point after midnight, she slipped away to the small chapel on the hospital's ground floor, a non-denominational space that served as a refuge for patients and staff alike. She sat alone in the dim candlelight, her posture finally relaxing from the constant vigilance she maintained elsewhere. In this moment of solitude, something of her true self emerged, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue, a loneliness that no amount of professional competence could fill. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply exist, without masks, without performance, without the careful calculations that governed her every interaction. When she returned to the department an hour later, the mask was firmly back in place, and no one would ever know that for a brief moment, Lena Parker had allowed herself to be human. January brought harsh weather to Charleston, a series of storms that lashed the coast with wind and rain unusual for the region. The emergency department saw its share of weather-related injuries, but the more significant impact was on staffing. Transportation became difficult, and those who lived furthest from the hospital often could not make it to their shifts. The burden fell disproportionately on those who lived nearby, or, like Lena, seemed to materialize whenever they were needed regardless of conditions. The relationship between Sarah Chen and Lena had evolved into something approaching friendship, or at least as close to friendship as Lena seemed capable of allowing. They took breaks together when schedules permitted, sharing quiet conversations that ranged from clinical cases to broader questions of philosophy and purpose. Sarah had learned not to push for personal information, accepting that Lena would share only what she chose to share, and that forcing the issue would result in withdrawal. What Sarah did learn, in fragments and implications, suggested a depth of experience that defied Lena's apparent position in life. She spoke of patient care with insights that seemed to come from far more than her years of nursing would account for. Her understanding of human psychology bordered on the clinical, as if she had made a formal study of how people behaved under stress, and occasionally, in unguarded moments, she would reference places or situations that seemed wildly out of context for a small-town nurse from Virginia. "Have you traveled much?" Sarah asked one evening, prompted by Lena's casual mention of monsoon seasons in Southeast Asia. Lena's expression flickered briefly before returning to its usual neutrality. Before nursing, I had a different life. It feels very distant now." Sarah waited for elaboration that did not come. She had learned to recognize these walls when they appeared, the subtle signals that a topic was closed for discussion. Whatever Lena's previous life had involved, it was clearly not something she wished to revisit. The winter storms eventually subsided, but they left behind a changed landscape in more ways than one. The hospital administration, responding to the staffing challenges exposed by the weather, began a systematic review of operational procedures. This review included an analysis of patient outcomes across different departments and shifts, the kind of data-driven assessment that modern healthcare increasingly demanded. The results, when they emerged, contained a statistical anomaly that caught the attention of the Quality Improvement Committee. Night shift outcomes in the emergency department had improved significantly over the past several months, with reduced complication rates, shorter lengths of stay, and higher patient satisfaction scores. The improvement correlated precisely with the period of Lena Parker's employment, though this connection was not immediately apparent to those analyzing the data. Dr. Morrison, who served on the Quality Committee, noticed the correlation during a routine review meeting. She remembered her conversation with Lena in the supply room, remembered the sense that there was more to this quiet nurse than met the eye, but she kept her observations to herself, filing them away with the other pieces of a puzzle she had not yet decided to solve. Meanwhile, the tensions within the department continued to simmer beneath the surface of professional routine. Dr. Harris had grown increasingly irritable as the winter progressed, his perpetual dissatisfaction finding new targets among the staff. His treatment of Lena remained consistently dismissive, but it was no longer exceptional, merely part of a broader pattern of hostility that affected everyone within his sphere of influence. The breaking point came on a frigid February night when the department was already stretched thin by multiple critical cases. A patient arrived by ambulance, a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and sustained serious injuries. The trauma team mobilized with practiced efficiency, but complications arose almost immediately. The patient's blood pressure dropped precipitously, indicating internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. Harris was the attending physician, and his decisions in the critical first minutes would determine whether the patient survived long enough to reach the operating room. But something was wrong with his judgment that night. His orders came too slowly. His assessments seemed clouded by confusion or distraction. The nurses exchanged worried glances as they followed protocols that did not seem adequate to the situation. Lena was positioned at the periphery of the action, maintaining supplies and monitoring equipment as she always did during major traumas, but her attention was fixed on the patient with an intensity that went beyond her assigned role. She watched the vital signs fluctuate, tracked the subtle changes in skin color and pupil response, and calculated a trajectory that the physician seemed unable to see. When Harris ordered a medication that Lena knew would worsen the patient's deteriorating condition, she faced a choice that violated every principle of hospital hierarchy. To speak up was to challenge a senior physician in front of the entire team, to risk her position and reputation on a judgment call that might be wrong. To remain silent was to watch a preventable tragedy unfold. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I believe the patient may have a tension pneumothorax developing on the left side. The tracheal deviation is subtle but present. A needle decompression might be indicated before additional fluids." The room fell silent. Harris turned to face her with an expression of outraged disbelief, his face reddening with fury. How dare you question my diagnosis? You are a nurse, not a physician. Your job is to follow orders, not give them. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered toward the patient, and some part of his medical training overrode his ego long enough to actually look at what Lena had described. The tracheal deviation was there, subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The patient's deterioration suddenly made sense through a different diagnostic lens. The next moments passed in a blur of activity as Harris performed the emergency procedure that Lena had suggested. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Trapped air hissed from the chest cavity, the patient's blood pressure stabilized, and the crisis transformed from catastrophic to manageable. Within minutes, he was stable enough for transport to the operating room, where surgeons would address the internal injuries. When the patient had been wheeled away and the trauma bay fell quiet, Harris turned to face Lena, with an expression she could not easily read. Anger was still present, but it was now mixed with something else, a reluctant recognition that her intervention had been correct when his judgment had failed. "We will discuss this later," he said through clenched teeth, then strode away without waiting for a response. The other staff members avoided Lena's eyes as they cleaned up the trauma bay, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. The quiet nurse who never spoke up, who accepted every slight and humiliation without protest, had just publicly corrected the department's most senior physician in a life-threatening situation. The social order of the emergency department had been disrupted in ways that would take time to fully understand. Sarah found Lena in the supply room an hour later, methodically restocking the equipment that had been depleted during the trauma. Her hands moved with their usual precision, but there was a tension in her shoulders that betrayed the cost of what she had done. "That was incredibly brave," Sarah said softly. "You saved that man's life." Lena continued her work without looking up. "I did what was necessary. Dr. Harris was having an off night. It could happen to anyone under pressure. I should not have embarrassed him publicly." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "You are worried about his embarrassment. He was about to make a fatal mistake, and you stopped him. That is not something to apologize for." "The hierarchy exists for reasons," Lena replied, her voice carrying a weight of experience that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Undermining it, even when necessary, has consequences. I have learned this before in other places. The right action is not always the safe action." Before Sarah could probe further, the door to the supply room opened and Gloria Hastings appeared. The charge nurse's expression was unreadable as she looked at Lena with what might have been grudging respect or calculating assessment. "Harris wants to see you in his office. Now." Lena nodded and set down the supplies she had been organizing. She walked past Sarah with a slight smile that might have been reassurance or resignation. Some storms cannot be avoided, they can only be weathered. The meeting with Dr. Harris did not go as anyone expected. The department had been bracing for an explosion, for disciplinary action or at least a public humiliation designed to restore the natural order of things. Instead, Harris kept the conversation private, behind closed doors, and when Lena emerged an hour later, her expression gave nothing away about what had transpired. Rumors circulated for days afterward. Some said Harris had threatened her with termination, others that she had been placed on probation. A few optimists suggested that he might have actually thanked her for catching his mistake, though this theory was generally dismissed as fantasy. The truth, known only to the two participants, was far more complicated. Harris had entered the meeting intending to reassert his authority, to find some way to punish Lena for her insubordination while maintaining plausible deniability about his own error. But as he sat across from her in his cluttered office, something about her calm demeanor unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. She did not defend herself or apologize, did not challenge him or show fear. She simply waited, watching him with eyes that seemed to see far more than he was comfortable revealing. "You made me look like a fool out there," he said finally, his voice carrying less conviction than he had intended. "That was not my intention, Dr. Harris. My only concern was the patient. Your concern should be following proper protocol. There are channels for raising clinical questions, ways of doing things that do not involve publicly contradicting attending physicians." Lena nodded slowly. "You are correct. I should have found a more discreet way to communicate my observation. I apologize for any embarrassment I caused." Her apology should have satisfied him, should have given him the victory he sought. Instead, it felt hollow, a formality offered without genuine submission. Harris found himself in the uncomfortable position of having won an argument while feeling distinctly outmaneuvered. "Where did you learn to spot a tension pneumothorax that subtle?" The question emerged before he could stop it, driven by a professional curiosity that temporarily overrode his personal grievance. Lena's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "I have worked in settings where resources were limited, and observation was often the only diagnostic tool available. You learn to see things that might otherwise be overlooked." It was not a complete answer, and both of them knew it. But Harris sensed that pushing further would yield nothing useful, would only expose his curiosity and diminish his position. He dismissed her with a warning about future behavior that carried little conviction, and spent the rest of his shift avoiding eye contact with anyone who might question what had happened. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred in the department's treatment of Lena. The open mockery diminished, replaced by a cautious wariness that acknowledged her demonstrated competence without quite accepting her into the social fabric. Staff members who had previously ignored her now offered grudging nods of recognition. Gloria Hastings, ever attuned to power dynamics, began assigning Lena to more complex cases, testing the limits of her abilities. Lena accepted these changes with the same equanimity she showed to everything else. She did not capitalize on her newfound status, did not seek to elevate her position or challenge the existing hierarchy. She continued to work her night shifts, continued to fade into the background when circumstances permitted, continued to intervene quietly when patient welfare demanded it. But the incident had drawn attention beyond the emergency department. Janet Williams, who had never fully abandoned her informal surveillance of Lena's employment, heard about the trauma case through the hospital grapevine. The story confirmed her suspicions that there was far more to this nurse than her unimpressive credentials suggested. She began documenting observations more carefully, creating a file that existed outside official channels, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally reveal itself. That moment seemed to recede further into the future as winter gave way to early spring. The hospital settled into its usual rhythms, crises managed and forgotten, staff coming and going, patients flowing through the system in an endless stream of human need. Lena remained a fixture of the night shift, unremarkable except to those who had learned to look more carefully. Dr. Sarah Chen continued to seek out Lena's company, their conversations evolving into a genuine connection that transcended professional boundaries. Sarah had learned not to ask direct questions about Lena's past, but she gathered fragments of information through careful attention to unguarded moments. She learned that Lena had no family to speak of, that she lived alone in a small apartment near the waterfront, that she spent her rare days off walking along the beach regardless of weather. "What are you looking for out there?" Sarah asked one evening, after Lena mentioned her solitary walks along the shore. Lena considered the question with unusual care. Perspective, perhaps. The ocean does not care about human problems. It just continues, wave after wave, patient and indifferent. There is something comforting in that indifference. Sarah heard something in those words that troubled her, a resignation that seemed at odds with the competence and dedication Lena showed in her work. She wanted to probe deeper, to understand what had created this complex woman who seemed simultaneously present and distant, but she had learned that Lena revealed herself only on her own terms, and forcing the issue would only result in retreat. The spring brought warmer weather and longer days to Charleston. The emergency department saw its usual seasonal shifts, with winter ailments giving way to outdoor injuries, and the first wave of summer tourists who underestimated the coastal sun. Through it all, Lena maintained her quiet vigil, watching over patients and colleagues alike with an attention that went beyond professional duty. It was during a particularly calm night in late April that the equilibrium finally shattered. Lena was monitoring the waiting area when her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, and Sarah, who happened to be nearby, saw her face transform in an instant. The careful mask dissolved, replaced by an expression of shock and something that looked very much like fear. Lena excused herself and walked quickly toward the staff exit. her composure crumbling with each step. Sarah followed at a distance, concern overriding respect for privacy. She found Lena in the parking lot, leaning against a concrete pillar, breathing in controlled patterns that seemed designed to suppress a rising panic. "Lena, what is wrong? What happened?" Lena looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed to see through her, focused on something far beyond the hospital parking lot. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of history that Sarah had always sensed but never fully understood. "A part of my past is about to catch up with me. I hoped it never would, but I always knew it might. There are things I have not told you, Sarah, things I have not told anyone here. I am not who you think I am." Before Sarah could respond, the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible, growing steadily louder. Lena's head turned toward the sound with the alertness of someone who had learned to track threats by instinct. Her expression shifted again, from fear to determination, as if some internal switch had been activated. "It has begun," she said, more to herself than to Sarah. "There is no avoiding it now. I can only hope I am still capable of doing what they need me to do." The helicopter was visible now, a dark shape against the starlit sky, bearing naval insignia that gleamed in the moonlight. It was not heading toward the designated helipad. It was coming directly toward the hospital, lights flashing, rotors creating a thunderous announcement that something extraordinary was about to occur. Lena straightened her posture and began walking back toward the emergency department. Her gait was different now, more purposeful, more commanding. Sarah followed, filled with questions that would have to wait for answers. Whatever was coming, whatever truth was about to be revealed, the quiet nurse who had hidden in plain sight was preparing to emerge from the shadows. The helicopter descended with a controlled urgency that spoke of military precision, its rotors slicing through the night air with a thunderous rhythm that silenced every conversation within 100 yards. Staff members emerged from the emergency department, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a Navy helicopter landing not on the designated helipad, but directly in the ambulance bay, scattering vehicles and personnel with the authority of absolute necessity. Before the rotors had fully stopped, uniformed figures began pouring from the aircraft. Marines in combat gear established a perimeter with weapons drawn, their faces obscured by tactical equipment, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. Behind them came officers in naval uniforms, their rank insignia glinting under the harsh emergency lights, their expressions carved from stone. The hospital security team, caught completely off guard, attempted to establish some semblance of order. Chief of Security Marcus Williams stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture that was half welcome, half demand for explanation. A Marine intercepted him before he could approach the helicopter, redirecting him with firm politeness toward a Navy commander who had just stepped onto the asphalt. "This facility is now under temporary military jurisdiction," the commander announced, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We have a critical situation that requires immediate medical intervention. Your full cooperation is expected and required." Inside the emergency department, chaos had given way to stunned paralysis. Patients in the waiting area huddled together, uncertain whether to flee or remain. Staff members clustered in small groups, exchanging worried glances and whispered speculations. Dr. Harris, who had been completing paperwork in his office, emerged with an expression of outraged authority that wilted visibly as he took in the scope of the military presence. Gloria Hastings proved more practical. She began directing staff to clear trauma bays, anticipating that whatever had arrived on that helicopter would require immediate medical attention. Her years of experience had taught her that asking questions could wait until the crisis was managed. It was in this atmosphere of controlled pandemonium that the stretcher emerged from the helicopter. 4 Marines carried it with careful precision, their pace urgent but measured, protecting their cargo from unnecessary jostling. The figure on the stretcher was covered with thermal blankets, an oxygen mask obscuring most of the face. But the severity of the situation was evident from the array of monitoring equipment and IV lines that accompanied the patient. A Navy medical officer walked alongside, rattling off vital signs and injury assessments to anyone who would listen. The patient had been retrieved from an operation gone wrong, had spent hours in conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits, had sustained injuries that required specialized intervention beyond what the ship's medical bay could provide. Dr. Morrison, who had been called in from home at the first sign of the crisis, pushed through the crowd to take charge of the incoming patient. Her experienced eyes performed a rapid assessment even as she walked, cataloguing the visible indicators of trauma, hypothermia, and systemic stress. This was not a routine emergency. This was the kind of case that tested the limits of civilian medical capability. "Get me a full trauma team assembled in Bay 1, she ordered, her voice cutting through the confusion with practiced authority. "I need warming equipment, blood products on standby, and someone find out exactly what we are dealing with here." The Navy medical officer stepped forward to provide the requested information, but before he could speak, a senior officer intervened. This was Admiral Catherine Walsh, a compact woman in her 50s, whose presence commanded immediate attention. She had arrived on the helicopter and had been conferring with the Marine commander, but now she stepped into the medical conversation with clear purpose. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate your willingness to assist, but this case requires a specific specialist. The patient's condition involves complications that go beyond standard trauma protocols. We need someone with particular training and experience." Morrison's brow furrowed with confusion and a touch of professional indignation. "Admiral, this is a Level 1 trauma center. We have specialists in every relevant field. Whatever your patient needs, and we can provide it." Admiral Walsh shook her head slowly. "With respect, Doctor, you cannot. The complications are not purely medical. They involve physiological responses to extreme environmental conditions that civilian medicine rarely encounters. We need someone who understands both the medical and operational aspects of the situation." "And who exactly would that be?" Harris interjected, having recovered enough composure to reassert his authority. "We have no military medical specialists on staff. If you needed someone with that background, you should have taken your patient to a naval hospital." The Admiral's expression remained impassive. "The nearest naval hospital with appropriate capabilities is 4 hours away. The patient does not have 4 hours. Fortunately, you do have someone on staff with the necessary qualifications." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air before continuing. "We need Lena Parker." The name landed like a physical blow, creating a ripple of confusion and disbelief through the assembled staff. Heads turned, eyes searched the crowd, whispers spread like wildfire. The quiet nurse who had been dismissed and mocked for months was suddenly the focus of a military operation that had commandeered their entire facility. Harris actually laughed, a sharp bark of incredulity. "Parker? She is barely competent to handle routine nursing duties. Whatever information you have must be mistaken." Admiral Walsh's gaze fixed on Harris with an intensity that silenced his laughter immediately. "Dr. Harris, I assure you, there is no mistake. Lieutenant Commander Lena Parker served with distinction in some of the most demanding medical environments on Earth. Her expertise in treating injuries sustained under extreme operational conditions is precisely what this patient requires. Now, where is she?" The title hung in the air like a revelation. Lieutenant Commander, naval officer. Not the meek nurse they thought they knew, but something else entirely, something that explained the gaps in her history and the competence she had tried so hard to hide. Sarah Chen had been watching from the periphery, her mind racing to reconcile the Lena she knew with the person Admiral Walsh was describing. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite her shock. She was in the parking lot a few minutes ago. She seemed to know something was coming. As if summoned by the words, Lena appeared at the entrance to the emergency department. But this was not the Lena who had worked beside them for months, the woman who avoided eye contact and accepted every slight without protest. This Lena stood straight, her shoulders squared, her gaze direct and commanding. She had removed her standard scrubs and now wore a simple black tactical shirt that emphasized the transformation in her bearing. She walked through the crowd of Marines and medical staff as if they were not there, her focus entirely on the stretcher and the patient it carried. Admiral Walsh stepped aside to give her access, a gesture of deference that spoke volumes about their history. "Report," Lena said, the single word carrying an authority that brooked no hesitation. The Navy medical officer responded immediately, providing a detailed account of the patient's condition, the circumstances of the injury, and the interventions already attempted. Lena listened without interruption, her eyes tracking the vital signs on the monitors, her hands already performing a preliminary assessment of the patient's responsiveness. He has been submerged in water below 40 degrees for approximately 90 minutes, the officer concluded. Rewarming was initiated on the ship, but we encountered complications. His core temperature is still dangerously low, and he is showing signs of cardiac irritability that we cannot stabilize. Lena nodded, her expression focused and calculating. The rewarming protocol was standard, which is the problem. When hypothermia is this severe and prolonged, the heart becomes extremely sensitive to temperature differentials. You cannot warm the core and periphery at the same rate without risking fatal arrhythmias. She turned to address the Mercy Harbor staff, her voice carrying easily across the crowded department. I need a controlled environment set up in Bay 1, warming blankets removed. I want cooled IV fluids ready, and I need a cardiac bypass team on standby. We are going to do this slowly and precisely, or we are going to lose him. Harris stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and confusion. Now wait just a minute. You cannot simply walk in here and start issuing orders. I am the attending physician, and no military authority supersedes my medical judgment in this facility. Lena turned to face him, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed him to see the full force of the person she had been hiding. Her eyes held his with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. Dr. Harris, I have spent the last 4 months observing your medical judgment. I have watched you miss diagnoses, dismiss patient concerns, and prioritize your ego over patient welfare. On a normal night, I would defer to your authority because the system functions better when hierarchies are respected. This is not a normal night. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. The man on that stretcher is a Navy SEAL who was injured during an operation that will never appear in any official record. He has a wife and 2 children who believe he is on a routine training exercise. He is also one of the finest men I have ever served with, and I will not allow your insecurity to cost him his life. So you can step aside voluntarily, or you can explain to Admiral Walsh why you interfered with a military medical operation. Your choice. Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words emerged. The authority in Lena's voice, the steel in her eyes, and the presence of armed Marines throughout his department combined to render his usual defenses useless. He stepped aside without another word, his face pale with a humiliation that cut far deeper than any public correction. Lena turned back to the waiting staff, her expression softening slightly but losing none of its command. I know this is unusual, and I know many of you have questions. Those questions will have to wait. Right now, I need the best trauma team this hospital can assemble, and I need everyone to trust that I know what I am doing. Can you do that? The silence stretched for a moment before Dr. Morrison stepped forward. You heard her. Let us get to work. The next several hours tested the limits of everyone involved. The trauma bay became a bubble of intense focus, sealed off from the chaos in the rest of the department by Marines who permitted entry only to essential personnel. Inside, Lena orchestrated a medical intervention unlike anything the Mercy Harbor staff had ever witnessed, combining standard protocols with techniques that seemed to come from a completely different realm of practice. The patient, whose name was never spoken aloud, responded slowly to the unconventional approach. His core temperature rose in carefully controlled increments, each degree monitored for cardiac response, each adjustment calculated with mathematical precision. Lena worked with a calm intensity that transformed the atmosphere in the room, her confidence infectious, her competence undeniable. Sarah Chen had volunteered to assist, driven by curiosity as much as professional duty. She watched Lena with new eyes, seeing the months of observation and reserve reconfigured into a coherent picture. Every small intervention that had seemed coincidental now revealed itself as deliberate expertise, every moment of deference exposed as strategic patience. You were never really just a nurse here, were you? Sarah asked during a brief pause in the action, when the patient's condition had stabilized enough to permit conversation. Lena did not look up from the monitor she was adjusting. I was exactly a nurse here. That part was never pretense. I just had additional training that was not relevant to the work I was doing. But you could have been so much more. You could have practiced at a level that matched your abilities. Why hide it? Lena paused, her hands stilling on the equipment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that went beyond the physical demands of the current crisis. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is anonymity. Because the skills I developed came at a cost I am still paying. Because I wanted to know if I could exist in a normal world, doing normal work, without the weight of what I used to be. She resumed her adjustments, the moment of vulnerability passing. I was a Navy nurse for 12 years. Then I was selected for a special program that trained medical personnel to operate in extreme environments. Combat zones, deep-sea operations, high-altitude rescues, places where conventional medicine does not apply, and improvisation means the difference between life and a very bad outcome. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the woman she thought she knew. What made you leave? The question hung in the air for a long moment. When Lena finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. I lost someone. Someone I was supposed to save. The circumstances were impossible. The outcome was inevitable. But that does not matter to the part of me that still sees his face when I close my eyes. I requested discharge, and they let me go because they understood that some wounds do not heal on deployment. She looked up then, meeting Sarah's eyes with an honesty that was almost painful to witness. I came to Charleston because it was far from anything that reminded me of that life. I took the night shift because it was the shift no one wanted, where I could be useful without being noticed. I let people think I was weak because strength had become too heavy to carry. Before Sarah could respond, the monitors began alarming. The patient's heart rhythm had become erratic, the careful progress of the past hours suddenly threatened by a cascade of complications. Lena's demeanor shifted instantly, the reflective mood replaced by sharp focus as she began issuing orders with rapid precision. The crisis lasted nearly 40 minutes, a sustained battle against physiological processes that seemed determined to claim the patient despite every intervention. Lena coordinated the response with a mastery that left the experienced Mercy Harbor staff in awe. She anticipated problems before they manifested, adjusted treatments with intuitive timing, and maintained a calm that steadied everyone around her. When the patient finally stabilized again, his vital signs stronger than they had been since his arrival, Lena allowed herself a moment of visible relief. She stepped back from the bedside, her shoulders sagging slightly with exhaustion, and accepted a cup of water from one of the nurses with a nod of thanks. Admiral Walsh had been observing from the corner of the room, her presence a constant reminder that this was not merely a medical emergency, but something larger, something connected to worlds that operated beyond civilian comprehension. She approached Lena now, her expression mixing gratitude with something more complex. Outstanding work, Commander. I knew we were right to come to you. Lena shook her head slowly. I am not a commander anymore, Admiral. I am just a nurse who happened to have the right experience for this situation. You resigned your commission, but you did not stop being what we made you. That capability does not simply disappear because you fill out paperwork. The observations seemed to cause Lena genuine discomfort. With respect, Admiral, what you made me nearly destroyed me. I have spent the past year trying to rebuild something resembling a normal life. This incident does not change that goal. Admiral Walsh studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. I understand, and I will not pretend that we had a right to pull you back into this world. But I want you to consider that perhaps normal is not what you think it is. Perhaps normal, for someone with your gifts, means using them where they are most needed. She glanced toward the patient, whose condition was now stable enough for transport. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, father of 2, husband to Emily, who teaches 3rd grade in San Diego. He will see his children grow up because you were here tonight. That matters, Lena. That will always matter, regardless of the paperwork. Lena did not respond, but something in her posture suggested that the words had landed somewhere deep. She watched as the Marines prepared to transfer the patient to the helicopter, which would now take him to the Naval Hospital for long-term recovery. The crisis was ending, but its ripples would continue to spread through the hospital and through her carefully constructed life. The departure of the military contingent was as dramatic as its arrival, though tinged now with an air of successful resolution. Marines filed out in orderly formation, officers exchanged formal courtesies with hospital administration, and the helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn sky with a roar that seemed to carry with it all the secrets of the night. In its wake, the emergency department slowly returned to something approaching normalcy. Patients who had been diverted to other facilities began trickling back. Staff members returned to their stations, exchanging glances heavy with unasked questions. The events of the past hours had fundamentally altered their understanding of their workplace and one of their colleagues. Lena remained in the now empty trauma bay, mechanically cleaning up the detritus of the intense medical intervention. Her movements were automatic, her mind clearly elsewhere, processing the collision between her two lives that she had worked so hard to prevent. Dr. Morrison found her there as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The older physician stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Lena work before speaking. "You should go home. Get some rest. You have been through something extraordinary tonight." Lena continued her cleaning without looking up. "I would rather stay busy. When I stop moving, I start thinking, and thinking is not particularly helpful right now." Morrison entered the room fully, closing the door behind her to create a bubble of privacy. "When I told you that some secrets are worth keeping, and some are worth sharing, I did not anticipate learning your secret quite this dramatically." A ghost of a smile crossed Lena's face. "Neither did I. I had hoped to finish out my year here and move on before anything like this could happen. The universe apparently had other plans. What will you do now? Your cover, such as it was, is thoroughly blown. Everyone in this department knows that you are not the person you pretended to be." Lena finally stopped her cleaning and turned to face Morrison. Her expression carried an uncertainty that was striking after the commanding presence she had displayed throughout the crisis. "I honestly do not know. I came here seeking invisibility, and now I am the most visible person in the hospital. Every dynamic that allowed me to function here has been disrupted. The logical thing would be to resign, to find another anonymous position somewhere else to start the process over again. Is that what you want?" The question seemed to catch Lena off guard. She considered it with the same careful attention she gave to clinical problems, searching for an honest answer rather than a convenient one. "I do not know what I want anymore. For so long, I wanted only to escape what I was. Now that I have been forced to become it again, even briefly, I feel something I did not expect." She paused, struggling to articulate the complex emotions. "I felt useful tonight, not just competent, but genuinely necessary. That feeling has been missing for longer than I realized." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding more than Lena perhaps intended to reveal. "Then perhaps the question is not whether to stay or go, but what kind of person you want to be going forward. The one who hides or the one who was on display tonight?" "They feel like the same person to me," Lena admitted. "She are just different aspects of someone who has not figured out how to integrate them." "Then maybe that is your next challenge, not running from either half, but finding a way to be whole." The sun rose over Charleston with the indifferent beauty that coastal mornings often possess, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed utterly disconnected from the drama that had unfolded in the darkness. Mercy Harbor Medical Center stood against this backdrop like a monument to human resilience, its windows reflecting the early light while inside. The machinery of healthcare continued its endless operation. Word of the night's events had spread through the hospital with the speed of institutional gossip. By the time the day shift arrived, everyone from the chief administrator to the newest janitor had heard some version of the story. The details varied in the telling, growing more elaborate with each repetition, but the core facts remained consistent. The quiet night nurse had been revealed as something extraordinary, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Lena had eventually succumbed to exhaustion around 6 in the morning, retreating to an empty on-call room where she fell into a dreamless sleep that lasted barely 3 hours. She awoke to find a small crowd gathered outside the door. Staff members who had come hoping for a glimpse of the woman they thought they knew, now transformed by revelation into someone fascinating and unknown. She navigated the gauntlet of curious faces with her characteristic reserve, offering polite nods but no explanations. making her way toward the exit with the single-minded focus of someone who desperately needed solitude. The parking lot presented its own challenges, as several local news vans had appeared, their crews setting up equipment for what would clearly become a story about military operations and civilian hospitals. Lena avoided them with practiced skill, taking a back route she had discovered during her months of invisible observation. She reached her car without being photographed, pulled out of the lot without being followed, and drove toward the waterfront apartment that had become her sanctuary in this city of strangers. The apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with the sparse functionality of someone who had learned to live without attachment to possessions. A few photographs adorned the walls, showing younger versions of Lena in naval uniform, standing with colleagues against backdrops that ranged from aircraft carriers to remote mountain outposts. These were the only visible evidence of the life she had tried to leave behind. She showered and changed into civilian clothes, then stood at her window watching the morning sun glitter on the harbor. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since she left the hospital, messages from colleagues, from hospital administration, from numbers she did not recognize. She ignored them all, needing time to process before she could engage with the world that was demanding her attention. A knock at her door interrupted her solitude around 11. She opened it to find Sarah Chen standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of determined compassion. "I know you probably want to be alone," Sarah said before Lena could speak, "but I also know that being alone right now might not be the best thing for you, so I brought caffeine and company. You can tell me to leave if you want, but at least take the coffee." Lena found herself smiling despite everything. She stepped aside to let Sarah enter, accepting the offered cup with a murmur of thanks. They settled on the small balcony overlooking the water, the morning warmth already building toward the heat of the day. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with the sounds of the harbor and the distant calls of seabirds. Sarah seemed content to wait, to let Lena set the pace of whatever conversation might develop. "I never intended to deceive anyone," Lena finally said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "When I came here, I genuinely wanted to be just a nurse, not a former Navy officer, not a specialist in extreme medicine, just someone who could help people without carrying the weight of everything that came before." Sarah nodded slowly. "You succeeded, in a way. For months you were exactly that. The deception was not in who you were, but in how much of yourself you showed." "Is there a difference?" "I think so. You did not pretend to have skills you lacked. You pretended to lack skills you had. That is a different kind of hiding." Lena considered this perspective, turning it over in her mind. "In my experience, people treat you differently when they know what you can do. They expect more, they rely on you more. They give you responsibilities that become impossible to set down. I was tired of being the one everyone turned to in a crisis. I wanted to know what it felt like to be ordinary. And now?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications about the future that Lena had been avoiding since dawn. She took a long sip of her coffee before attempting an answer. "Now I am not sure ordinary was ever really an option for me. Last night, when that helicopter landed, something woke up that I thought I had put to sleep permanently. The focus, the certainty, the sense of purpose. I had forgotten how that felt, and now that I have remembered, I do not know if I can go back to pretending it does not exist." Sarah reached over and touched her hand, a gesture of simple human connection. "Maybe you do not have to pretend. Maybe there is a version of your life where you can be both the quiet nurse and the extraordinary specialist, where you do not have to choose between hiding and being consumed by what you can do. What would that look like? I do not know, but I think it starts with not running away this time, with staying here, where people now know your truth, and figuring out how to live with that knowledge instead of fleeing from it." Lena turned to look at Sarah directly, seeing in her young colleague a wisdom that transcended experience. "You sound very sure about something that is deeply uncertain," Sarah smiled gently. "I am sure about you. I have watched you for months, remember? I saw who you were even when you were trying to hide it. The woman who caught Dr. Harris's mistake, who saved that baby with meningitis, who kept the department running through impossible nights. That woman was real, regardless of what title she carried. The only question is whether you can accept that she was real and that she is worth being." The words landed with an impact that Lena had not anticipated. Throughout her months of hiding, she had viewed her competence as a burden, something to be suppressed rather than celebrated. The idea that it might instead be something worth embracing, something that could coexist with the ordinary life she craved, opened possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider. "The hospital administration wants to meet with me this afternoon," she said, changing the subject to something more concrete. "I imagine they have questions about my employment history that will be difficult to answer honestly. What will you tell them? The truth, I suppose, or as much of it as I am permitted to share. There are aspects of my service that remain classified, but the general outline can be disclosed with proper authorization. Admiral Walsh left me contact information for the Navy's Public Affairs Office, in case I needed assistance managing the situation." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That seems unusually accommodating for a military that values secrecy." Lena allowed herself a small smile. "The Admiral and I have history. She was my commanding officer during some of my most difficult assignments. I think she feels a certain responsibility for what I became, and perhaps some guilt for how it ended. Helping me navigate this situation is her way of acknowledging that debt. Will you accept the help?" "I will accept whatever allows me to move forward with integrity. If that means revealing more of my past than I had planned, so be it. The alternative is to continue living a lie, and I have discovered that I no longer have the energy for that." They sat together in comfortable silence as the morning advanced toward noon. The harbor traffic increased, boats coming and going on errands that seemed blissfully disconnected from the complications of Lena's life. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll, marking the passage of time with its steady rhythm. When Sarah finally left, promising to return later to check on her, Lena remained on the balcony, contemplating the water and the sky and the uncertain future that stretched before her. The day's challenges awaited: difficult conversations, awkward explanations, the task of rebuilding a professional identity that had been constructed on careful omissions. But beneath the anxiety, she felt something she had not experienced in a long time. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably present. The possibility that she might find a way to be whole, to integrate the disparate pieces of herself into something sustainable, no longer seemed entirely impossible. She finished her coffee, went inside to prepare for the meetings ahead, and allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that the future might hold something other than hiding. The conference room on the 4th floor of Mercy Harbor Medical Center had never felt so small. Lena sat at one end of the polished table, facing a row of administrators whose expressions ranged from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. Robert Chen from Human Resources occupied the center position, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel and the chief medical officer, Dr. William Hartford. Janet Williams sat slightly apart from the group, her presence a testament to the concerns she had raised months ago, now vindicated in ways she could never have anticipated. The meeting had been scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, giving Lena just enough time to contact the Navy Public Affairs Office and receive authorization to disclose certain aspects of her service record. The authorization came with limitations, of course. Specific operations remained classified, certain details could not be shared, but the general framework of her career could now be discussed openly. "Let me be direct, Ms. Parker," Robert Chen began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating legally treacherous waters. "Your employment here was based on credentials that, while technically valid, did not accurately represent your qualifications or history. We need to understand the extent of these discrepancies and determine what, if any, action is appropriate." Lena nodded, having expected this opening. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Chen, and I appreciate the opportunity to address them directly. You are correct that my application did not fully represent my background. I would like to explain why, and then answer whatever questions you have to the extent I am permitted." She took a breath, organizing her thoughts before continuing. "I served in the United States Navy for 12 years, initially as a nurse and eventually as a specialist in what the military calls austere medicine. This involves providing care in environments where traditional medical infrastructure does not exist. Combat zones, disaster areas, covert operations in locations I am not permitted to name. The administrators exchanged glances, their skepticism giving way to attention. This was not the explanation they had expected from the woman they remembered as the quiet, unremarkable night nurse. During my service, I received extensive additional training in trauma management, environmental medicine, and emergency procedures adapted for extreme conditions. I held the rank of lieutenant commander and was assigned to units that operated in circumstances requiring the highest levels of clearance and capability. Dr. Hartford leaned forward, his medical curiosity overriding administrative caution. Why would someone with those qualifications apply for a basic nursing position at a civilian hospital? Surely there were opportunities more suited to your experience. Lena met his eyes with the directness she had hidden for so long. Because I did not want opportunities suited to my experience, Dr. Hartford, I wanted to escape that experience. 18 months ago, I was involved in an operation that went catastrophically wrong. A colleague, someone I was responsible for keeping alive, did not survive despite everything I tried. The circumstances were beyond anyone's control, but that knowledge did not ease the burden of what happened. She paused, allowing the weight of the admission to settle. I requested discharge from the Navy and was granted an honorable separation, but I found that civilian life did not know what to do with me. Every position I was qualified for reminded me of what I had lost. Every interview that went well led to expectations I could not bear to fulfill. So I made a choice that I recognize now was not entirely honest. "You chose to hide," Janet Williams said, speaking for the first time. Her voice carried no judgment, only a kind of sad understanding. "Yes, I simplified my credentials to the minimum required for employment. I sought a position where I could be useful without being exceptional. I wanted to know if I could exist in a world where no one expected me to be the person who saves lives in impossible situations." Lena's voice softened. "I wanted to know if I could be ordinary." The room fell silent as the administrators processed this information. The legal counsel was already making notes, calculating exposure and liability. Robert Chen's expression had shifted from skepticism to something more complex, a recognition of the human dimensions that existed beyond policy considerations. "The events of last night have obviously changed the situation," Chen said finally. "Your capabilities are now known, and your employment history will need to be formally corrected. The question before us is what happens next." Before Lena could respond, the door to the conference room opened and Dr. Morrison entered, followed by Gloria Hastings and, unexpectedly, Dr. Michael Harris. Their arrival had clearly not been planned by the administrators, who exchanged confused looks at the interruption. "Forgive the intrusion," Morrison said, her tone suggesting she did not actually require forgiveness. "But we learned this meeting was taking place, and we felt it was important that the clinical staff have a voice in whatever decisions are made." She took a seat without waiting for permission, and the others followed her lead. Harris, notably, chose a position at the far end of the table, as distant from Lena as the room would allow. "The emergency department has been discussing the situation since this morning," Morrison continued. "We wanted you to know that regardless of the discrepancies in Ms. Parker's application, her performance during her time here has been exemplary, more than exemplary. We have identified multiple instances where her interventions prevented serious harm to patients, interventions that were never formally documented or acknowledged." Gloria Hastings nodded in agreement, a significant gesture from someone who had been among Lena's harshest critics. "I owe her an apology. We all do. We saw what we expected to see, and we missed what was actually in front of us. That is on us, not her." The administrator's legal counsel shifted uncomfortably. "While we appreciate the clinical perspective, there are policy considerations that must be addressed. Employment fraud, even well-intentioned employment fraud, creates institutional liability that cannot simply be overlooked." "What fraud?" Morrison asked sharply. "She has a valid nursing license. She passed all required background checks. She performed her assigned duties competently. The fact that she is capable of more than her job required is not fraud, it is modesty." The debate continued for another hour, positions staked out and defended, compromises proposed and rejected. Throughout it all, Lena remained largely silent, observing the people around her with the same careful attention she had always brought to her work. She watched Harris struggle with the cognitive dissonance of acknowledging her competence after months of dismissing her. She watched Janet Williams advocate for policies that would prevent future misunderstandings, while acknowledging that this particular situation defied easy categorization. Finally, Dr. Hartford called for a pause in the proceedings. "We are going in circles. Perhaps we should hear from Ms. Parker herself about what she wants. This meeting has been about institutional concerns, but there is a person at the center of it, whose wishes we have not actually consulted." All eyes turned to Lena, who took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. "When I came to Charleston, I was running from something I did not know how to face. I thought that if I could become invisible, if I could shed the identity that had been built around my capabilities, I might find peace. What I found instead was a different kind of burden. The burden of watching problems I could solve go unsolved, of knowing I could do more while pretending I could not." She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Last night forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. I am not ordinary, no matter how much I might wish to be. The skills I have, the training I received, these are not things that can be turned off because they become inconvenient. They are part of who I am." Her voice strengthened as she continued, "I would like to stay at Mercy Harbor, if you will have me. Not as the invisible nurse I was pretending to be, but as someone who can contribute fully. I do not know exactly what that looks like. Perhaps there is a role that allows me to use my expertise without being consumed by it. Perhaps there is a way to be exceptional when necessary and ordinary the rest of the time." She paused, a hint of vulnerability entering her expression. "What I know for certain is that I am tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending to be less than I am, because being more is frightening. Whatever the outcome of this meeting, I want to move forward with honesty. Even if that honesty creates complications I would rather avoid." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. This was not the silence of calculation or judgment, but of recognition. Something had shifted in the room, a collective acknowledgement that they were dealing with a situation that transcended policy manuals and liability concerns. Dr. Hartford spoke first. "I think we can find a way forward that serves everyone's interests. The hospital could benefit from someone with Ms. Parker's capabilities properly positioned and supported. The emergency department, in particular, could use a clinical specialist with expertise in trauma and crisis management." Robert Chen nodded slowly, the administrator in him yielding to a more pragmatic perspective. "We would need to formalize the arrangement properly. Updated credentials, appropriate compensation, clear role definition. But in principle, I do not see why this could not work." The legal counsel began to protest about precedents and procedures, but was silenced by a look from Dr. Hartford. Some matters, the look suggested, were better resolved by wisdom than by policy. As the meeting wound toward conclusion, Harris finally spoke, his voice subdued but sincere. "I owe you an apology, Parker. I treated you badly because you did not fit my expectations of what a nurse should be. I see now that my expectations were the problem, not you." Lena accepted the apology with a gracious nod. "We all carry assumptions that sometimes blind us to what is actually there. I am not immune to that tendency myself. The formal decisions would take days to finalize, paperwork and approvals moving through institutional channels at their inevitable pace. But the essential outcome had been determined in that conference room. Lena Parker would remain at Mercy Harbor Medical Center, no longer hiding in the shadows, no longer pretending to be less than she was. When the meeting finally adjourned and the participants dispersed, Sarah Chen was waiting in the hallway. She had heard nothing of the proceedings, but she could read the outcome in Lena's face, in the slight relaxation of shoulders that had carried tension for far too long. "Good news?" Sarah asked hopefully. Lena allowed herself a genuine smile. Perhaps the first truly unguarded smile she had offered since arriving in Charleston. "Good news. Different news. I am not entirely sure what comes next, but for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to finding out." They walked together toward the elevator, two colleagues who had become something closer to friends, their footsteps echoing in the hospital corridor. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that stretched ahead of them like paths waiting to be traveled. "What changed?" Sarah asked as they waited for the elevator to arrive. "In the meeting, what made them decide to let you stay?" Lena considered the question as the elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. "I think what changed was me. I stopped apologizing for who I am. I stopped treating my capabilities as something to be ashamed of, rather than something to be offered. And when I did that, when I stood in my truth instead of hiding from it, other people responded to that truth." The elevator began its descent, carrying them back toward the emergency department where their work waited. Through the windows of the elevator lobby, the Charleston harbor sparkled in the afternoon light, boats moving across the water in patterns that seemed random but were actually guided by currents and destinations invisible to the casual observer. "And there is a lesson in that," Lena said softly, almost to herself. "We spend so much energy trying to be what we think others want us to be. We hide our strengths because they might intimidate. We minimize our capabilities because they might create expectations we fear we cannot meet. But in doing so, we deprive the world of what we actually have to offer." She turned to face Sarah directly, her expression carrying a warmth that had rarely been visible during her months of hiding. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I was trying so hard not to be seen. Your persistence in looking past my defenses made a difference I cannot fully articulate." Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, moved by the sincerity of the gratitude. "You made it easy. Even hidden, you were someone worth knowing. I just had to be patient enough to wait for you to realize that yourself." The elevator reached the ground floor, and they emerged into the familiar chaos of the emergency department. The sights and sounds that had formed the backdrop of Lena's hidden existence now seemed different somehow, charged with new possibility. She was not merely tolerated here anymore. She was wanted, valued for exactly who she was rather than in spite of it. Dr. Morrison caught her eye from across the department and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Gloria Hastings, processing a new patient at the triage desk, gave her something that might almost have been a smile. Even the other nurses and technicians who had ignored her for months now looked at her with something approaching respect. It would take time for the new dynamics to settle into comfortable patterns. There would be awkwardness and adjustment, old habits dying hard and new relationships slowly forming. But the foundation had been laid for something sustainable, something honest, something that allowed Lena to be whole. As she prepared to begin her shift, Lena paused for a moment to look around the department that had become her unexpected home. The quiet nurse who had arrived seeking invisibility was gone, replaced by someone willing to be seen, to be known, to offer her gifts without apology or diminishment. The journey was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena Parker was walking that journey as herself, complete and unafraid. And that, she realized, was exactly where she was meant to be. Dear listeners, we hope that Lena's story has touched your heart the way it touched ours. Her journey from hiding in the shadows to stepping into her full light reminds us that our greatest strengths are not burdens to be hidden, but gifts to be shared with the world. If this story resonated with you, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating tales of courage, redemption, and the extraordinary moments that reveal who we truly are. You can find it right here by clicking on your left. If you enjoyed this story, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the beautiful complexity of human life, the moments that challenge us, and the connections that save us. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever hidden a part of yourself that you later learned to embrace? Share your thoughts with our community. Do not miss our upcoming content. We will be waiting for you in the next story.